A heavy wooden door shut behind Cardinal Gerd Müller as he stepped into the private library, and the sound seemed out of place, almost too final for a room designed to hide conversations from the world. He had walked these Vatican corridors many times before, where silence was part of the discipline, not emptiness. But this time, something was different. There were no assistants waiting outside, no secretary arranging papers, no recorder quietly capturing every word, not even a phone resting on the table within reach. Only Pope Leo XIV sat at the far end, two untouched glasses of water placed neatly between them, and a single black folder positioned with deliberate precision. Müller noticed his own name written on that folder before the Pope said a single word. And in that moment, the atmosphere of the room shifted. Pope Leo did not stand to greet him. There was no polite smile, no soft introduction, none of the usual gestures that ease tension in Vatican meetings. Instead, he looked directly at the cardinal with steady, unreadable calm, as if the conversation had already begun long before Müller entered. Then he spoke simply, telling him to sit down. 3 days earlier, something had taken place inside this very room that was never meant to leave it. There was no official transcript, no witness, no record stored anywhere in the Vatican archives. Yet Rome has always had a way of letting secrets breathe beyond closed doors. A cancelled speaking engagement in Texas, a missing interview, a carefully worded public statement from a foundation suddenly trying to distance itself. All of it began to form a quiet pattern. In the corridors of the church, voices that once spoke freely had started to lower, because word had spread that Pope Leo XIV had said 5 things to Cardinal Müller that were never meant to be repeated. Those 5 things touched names, power, money, Germany, and the long conflict tied to the legacy of Pope Francis. For Müller, it was not just a conversation, it was a confrontation. With years of public opposition, he believed he had justified his loyalty. And now, that entire history was sitting in front of him in a black folder. The Pope finally opened it. He did not rush. He did not look at Müller as he turned the first page. He simply read, as though every line had already been studied long before the meeting began. The silence in the room grew heavier with each page he turned. Müller sat down more slowly than he expected, not because the chair was distant, but because every movement suddenly felt exposed. For several seconds, only the quiet turning of paper filled the room. Outside, the Apostolic Palace continued its usual rhythm, guards at their posts, footsteps echoing faintly in distant halls. But inside this library, the world had narrowed to one table and 2 men, both aware that this was no ordinary audience. Müller had expected disagreement. What he had not expected was documentation. The Pope finally spoke without looking up from the file. He told Müller that his war with the previous papacy had ended that day. The words were calm, but they landed with weight. There was no anger in them, no raised voice, only certainty. Müller's hands tightened slightly on the arms of his chair. For years, he had spoken with confidence in interviews, lectures, and books, believing he was defending truth against confusion. He had criticized Pope Francis openly, describing his concerns as theological duty, even moral obligation. But now, those same words had been transformed into printed records laid out in front of him. Trying to hold his ground, Müller responded that he had no war with anyone. But the Pope lifted one hand gently, stopping him without effort, without force. He did not need to argue. He simply continued reading from the folder. Inside were years of interviews, internal notes, published statements, and correspondence tied to the long dispute over the direction of the Church after Francis. Some carried Müller's name directly. Others connected him through networks that operated more quietly. But the pattern was unmistakable. The Pope turned another page, then another, allowing the documents to speak for themselves. Then he addressed it directly. He told Müller that for 10 years he had worked to weaken Pope Francis through books, interviews, and public influence. He described how every criticism, every suggestion of doctrinal confusion, every carefully chosen phrase had built a narrative of opposition. Müller defended himself quickly, saying he had only spoken the truth as he saw it. But this time, Pope Leo looked up. His voice remained steady, but sharper now in meaning. He reminded Müller that Francis had been dead for over a year, and that whatever conflict had existed was already over. Then he said the words plainly. The war was finished, and Müller had lost it. For the first time, there was no reply. Müller looked between the folder and the man across from him, searching for the familiar ground he used in public debates. But there was no audience here, no media, no supporters to interpret his words, only documents and silence. The Pope turned another page, then placed his finger beside a paragraph on the sheet. He told Müller that there would be no more articles, no more interviews, no more conferences where the former Pope's name was used to fund opposition or shape narratives. The tone remained controlled, but the meaning was firm. It was not a request. It was an end. Müller leaned forward slightly, attempting to reframe the situation, saying the Pope had a duty not to act out of personal offense. But the sentence did not land as intended. The room had already shifted beyond argument. The authority Müller had relied on outside this room no longer functioned here. The Pope closed part of the folder and opened a new section. Then he removed a single sheet and placed it in front of Müller, without explanation. The cardinal looked down, read the first lines, and his expression changed immediately. He asked where the document came from. Pope Leo did not answer that question. He simply said it did not matter. What mattered was that it existed. And as Müller read further, he realized it was not something he had written, but something written about him. Müller stared at the document in front of him, trying to steady his breathing as he read line after line. It was not a public statement, not a published article, and not something he had ever seen before. It was an internal communication written by individuals operating around him, describing a coordinated strategy that used his name as a central figure. His presence was being positioned not as a participant, but as a symbol around which opposition could be organized. The text described plans to frame the new papacy as a continuation of the previous one, but in a way that would weaken its authority from the beginning. It spoke about influence, about donors, about media channels, and about shaping perception before the new pope had even fully settled into his role. Müller's name appeared repeatedly, not as author, but as endorsement, authority, and justification. The more he read, the more his hands began to lose stability. He turned the pages slowly, as if moving too quickly might make the meaning more severe. The silence from Pope Leo across the table made everything heavier. The Pope did not interrupt. He did not explain. He simply waited while the document revealed itself. When Müller finally looked up, his voice was lower. He said he had not authorized any of it. He insisted he had no control over such planning. Pope Leo nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it as resolution. He responded calmly that he already knew Müller had not written it. That answer unsettled Müller more than accusation would have, because it meant the issue was not authorship, it was awareness. The Pope leaned slightly forward and said that Müller had known about these efforts and had done nothing to stop them. That single sentence changed the nature of the conversation. It was no longer about what had been said or written. It was about what had been allowed to continue. Müller tried again to defend himself, saying that others had used his name without his approval. But Pope Leo remained focused. He explained that silence, in situations like this, is not neutral. It becomes participation. The words were not loud, but they were precise, and they carried the weight of something already concluded. The Pope then tied the accusation back to Müller's own past writings. He reminded him that he had once written about moral responsibility, about the nature of silence in the face of wrongdoing. The Pope did not raise his voice. He simply stated that those same principles were now being reflected back at him. For a moment, Müller did not respond. His eyes lowered to the table, then to the papers again, as if searching for a different interpretation of what was in front of him. But the structure of the argument left no space for escape. The documents were not emotional claims. They were records. Outside the library, life in the Apostolic Palace continued without interruption. Guards maintained their positions. Footsteps echoed in distant corridors. But inside, the space felt compressed, reduced to a single exchange between evidence and memory. The Pope did not rush to fill the silence. He allowed it to remain, as if giving Müller time to fully absorb the weight of what had been placed before him. That silence became its own form of pressure, not aggressive, but steady and unavoidable. Then the Pope moved to the next section of the folder. The subject shifted. Germany. The single word carried its own history between them. For years, Müller had been a vocal figure in discussions about the German Church, often warning about theological directions he believed were dangerous. He had become a reference point for criticism, a voice frequently cited in debates far beyond his own country. Now the Pope opened a new set of documents related to that very topic. He mentioned a letter Müller had written privately to several German bishops. Müller's expression changed before the Pope even finished the sentence. The Pope described its contents without emotion. The letter suggested that if certain reforms continued, a coordinated resistance would be formed. It implied connections in Rome. It suggested influence within the Vatican. It presented itself as both warning and authority. Müller interrupted briefly, insisting that the letter was private and not intended for public scrutiny. The Pope acknowledged that immediately. He said it was private. Then he added that possession was not the issue. Content was. The Pope then read sections of the letter aloud in summary form, describing how it positioned Müller as a central figure in potential resistance to the German bishop's reforms. The tone remained unchanged, but the implications deepened with every line. He closed the document and said something that shifted the entire balance of the room. He told Müller that he was not weak, but quiet, and that there was a difference between the two. The statement was simple, but it redefined how authority was being expressed in that moment. Müller attempted to respond, but the Pope continued without pause. He stated clearly that the German Church did not belong to Müller's influence or protection. It had a Pope, and that authority could not be shared or redirected through informal networks. The words were not loud, but they were final in tone. They did not invite discussion. They established position. For the first time, Müller seemed to realize that the structure he had relied on outside this room had no effect here. Reputation, alliances, historical influence, none of it held weight against the documents laid out in front of him. The Pope closed that section of the folder slowly and moved to the next, preparing to shift the conversation again, while Müller remained still, absorbing the realization that this meeting was not about disagreement. It was about exposure. The Pope turned the next section of the folder without haste, as though every transition had already been planned long before Müller entered the room. The topic changed again, but the pressure in the room did not ease. It only shifted shape. This time, it was no longer about past criticism or theological disputes. It was about structure, influence, and the financial networks surrounding the Church. Müller watched carefully as several documents were laid out one by one. These were not abstract accusations. They were organized records, lists, and summaries, tied to foundations operating across different countries. Two were based in the United States, one in Switzerland. They presented themselves publicly as defenders of tradition, publishers of theological work, and supporters of Catholic education and media. But inside the folder, they appeared differently, not as isolated organizations, but as connected channels of influence, funding conferences, producing media content, and shaping public narratives around church leadership. The Pope did not describe them with emotional language. He described them with precision. He told Müller that over the last several years, he had participated in this ecosystem more than he had acknowledged. Speaking engagements, advisory roles, interviews, and endorsements were all documented. Each entry was supported by dates, locations, and financial records where applicable. Nothing was speculative. Everything was traceable. Müller shifted slightly in his chair, as if the weight of the information was physical. He began to understand that this was not a moral debate being presented to him. It was a mapped structure of activity, carefully assembled and already verified. The Pope then stated it clearly. He said Müller had effectively become a paid voice, within a broader opposition network, not as a hidden actor, but as a recognized figure whose presence added authority to campaigns and messaging already in motion. Müller attempted to respond immediately. He insisted that the organizations were defending the faith, that their intentions were not political but spiritual. But the Pope stopped him with a calm, direct look that required no additional force. He said the organizations were not defending the faith. They were defending a brand, and that brand included Müller's name. That distinction, spoken without emotion, changed the tone of everything that followed. The Pope continued by referencing financial records. Over the past 3 years, more than 400,000 had been received through speaking fees, advisory arrangements, book collaborations, and event participation. Each figure was presented not as rumor, but as documented entry. He explained that none of it needed to be illegal to become relevant. The issue was not legality, it was alignment. Influence had been structured, and Müller had been positioned within it, whether he fully recognized it or not. Müller finally tried to push back again. He said these groups supported Catholic teaching and helped preserve doctrine that was being weakened elsewhere. His voice carried more urgency now, but less certainty than before. The Pope listened, then responded with a single sentence that cut through the justification. He said they were not defending doctrine, they were shaping perception. And Müller had become part of that process. The room grew quiet again, not because anything had ended, but because there was nothing left to add to that exchange. The documents on the table had already done most of the speaking. Then the Pope gave instructions, and the tone shifted from analysis to decision. He told Müller that effective immediately, he would step away from all paid advisory roles connected to the 3 foundations. There would be no further participation in their conferences, no publishing through their networks, and no involvement in their organized events. If he wished to write, it would be through recognized Catholic publishers under the Holy See. If he wished to speak, it would be within dioceses, not private donor environments. Müller's expression tightened. He called the situation unprecedented. The word hung in the air for a moment. The Pope responded without hesitation. He said it was not unprecedented. It was overdue. There was no anger in his tone, only finality. Then he presented it as a choice. Müller could retain his title, his residence, and his position within the Church. But the parallel system of influence built around conferences, foundations, and external platforms would no longer continue in the same form. It would end. The folder remained open, but the meaning of it had changed. It was no longer just evidence. It had become boundary. For the first time in the meeting, silence lasted longer than any sentence. And Müller did not respond immediately. He looked down, then back at the documents, then briefly at the Pope, as if trying to find a different version of the situation that allowed negotiation. But there was none. The Pope closed the folder slowly. The sound was soft, but it marked a clear shift. The evidence phase of the meeting had ended. What remained was personal. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Müller directly, not as an opponent, but as someone who still had time to decide what kind of path he would leave the room with. The atmosphere had changed completely. What began as documentation had now become direction. And Müller, for the first time, was no longer responding to arguments. He was facing consequences already set in motion. The folder remained closed, but its presence still dominated the table, as if everything inside it had already settled into the room's atmosphere. Pope Leo did not speak immediately. He simply studied Müller for a moment, not with judgment alone, but with a kind of clarity that made avoidance difficult. Then he leaned slightly forward and began speaking in a different tone. The earlier part of the meeting had been about evidence, structure, and accountability. Now it shifted toward intent. He told Müller that this was no longer about past disputes or institutional disagreements. It was about what kind of future the Church would carry forward from this point. Müller sat quietly, still absorbing what had already been presented. The confidence he had entered with had not disappeared completely, but it had weakened, replaced by something more uncertain. The Pope noticed that change, but did not comment on it directly. Instead, he spoke about responsibility. He explained that leadership within the Church could not exist in parallel systems of influence, where authority was split between official positions and external networks. He said the structure itself created confusion, even when individuals believed their intentions were pure. Then he addressed Müller directly. He said that what had been built around him over the years was no longer just a matter of personal reputation. It had become a system that other people were using, extending beyond him in ways that were no longer fully under his control. Müller tried to respond, but this time his words were slower. He repeated that he had always acted in defense of doctrine and truth. The Pope listened without interruption, allowing him to finish completely. When Müller stopped speaking, Pope Leo replied with calm precision. He said that defending truth could not be separated from the consequences of how that defense was carried out. He reminded Müller that influence, once created, does not remain personal. It becomes shared, expanded, and used by others with different intentions. The conversation then turned to something deeper. The Pope spoke about time, not as history, but as responsibility. He reminded Müller of his age, his decades of service, and the positions he had already held within the Church. He listed them not to elevate him, but to frame what remained. He said that a life spent in service does not end with continuous conflict. At some point, it either becomes reflection or repetition. And repetition, he implied, eventually loses meaning. Müller listened without responding. His gaze shifted briefly toward the table, then back to the Pope, as if searching for a response that was no longer easily accessible. Then the Pope's tone softened slightly, though his words remained firm. He said he was not there to destroy Müller, nor to humiliate him, nor to erase his work. He made that clear without hesitation. But he also said he could not allow the Church to function as a space where personal battles continued indefinitely under the cover of doctrine. There was a pause after that. Not empty, but dense. Then Pope Leo said something that marked the emotional center of the meeting. He told Müller that what he truly wanted was for him to stop, not to lose dignity, not to be silenced in humiliation, but to step out of the cycle that had defined him for years. The word stop was simple, but it carried weight because it was not framed as punishment. It was presented as release. Müller's expression shifted slightly. The tension in his posture had not fully disappeared, but something beneath it began to loosen. The Pope continued, now speaking less like an authority issuing directives, and more like someone appealing to a person he still recognized as part of the Church's deeper life. He acknowledged Müller's decades of service, his academic work, his theological contributions, and the respect he had once held across different regions. He did not erase those things. Instead, he placed them beside what had come later, the conflicts, the campaigns, the long opposition cycle that had defined recent years. Then he said that somewhere along the way, conviction had become entangled with bitterness. And that bitterness, once it becomes identity, begins to reshape everything around it, even good work from earlier years. Müller did not interrupt. For the first time, he remained completely silent through the entire explanation. The Pope's voice softened further, but remained steady. He said he was asking as a brother in faith, not as an opponent, that Müller consider laying it down. The campaigns, the public battles, the networks of influence, all of it. He suggested something different for the remaining years of his life. Writing about Christ again, theology without conflict, reflection without opposition. Not as retreat, but as restoration. The room felt still after that, not in tension, but in weight. Müller's eyes lowered briefly. There was no dramatic reaction, no visible collapse, but something had clearly shifted in how he was receiving the words. The argument was no longer external. It had become internal. The Pope did not press further. He simply allowed the silence to remain, giving it space to settle, rather than forcing an immediate response. Then, after a long pause, he stood slowly, not abruptly, not as an ending, but as a transition. He told Müller to take time, whether days or longer, and to decide without pressure from anyone outside that room. He added that whatever choice was made would shape not only his future role, but how he would be remembered within the Church. The meeting, at that point, did not end with a declaration. It ended with space. Pope Leo walked toward the door and opened it himself. There was no ceremony, no final gesture of authority, only a quiet release from the enclosed tension of the library. Before Müller stepped out, the Pope said one last thing in a calm voice. He told him to decide soon, because delay itself would become its own kind of decision. Then the door closed behind him, and the room returned to silence. Within 48 hours after Müller left the Apostolic Palace, the first visible shifts began to appear, not through announcements or official declarations, but through absence. His scheduled appearance in Texas was cancelled, followed shortly by another event in Madrid. Both were tied to conferences that had expected large audiences and strong media attention. The explanations were brief, limited to personal reasons, and offered no further detail. That lack of detail, more than the cancellations themselves, drew attention. Shortly after, two of the foundations referenced in the Vatican folder issued carefully worded statements. They emphasized independence, clarified organizational structure, and avoided direct mention of Müller. The language was cautious, almost defensive, as if responding to something unspoken, rather than directly named. Those familiar with such communications understood what was happening without it needing to be stated. Inside Rome, the response was quieter but more significant. Requests for private audiences began to reach the Pope from other senior church figures connected to similar circles of influence. None were granted immediately. Instead, they were instructed to submit written explanations of their concerns before any meeting would be considered. The instruction moved through Vatican channels without public comment, but it was understood as deliberate control of access. Müller himself did not reappear in public during this period. There were no interviews, no statements, and no clarifications. The media outlets that had previously relied on his commentary received nothing. Emails went unanswered. Calls were not returned. The consistent public voice that had once shaped debates had suddenly gone silent. That silence created more impact than any speech could have. Within church circles, people began to notice not just his absence, but the absence of reaction around him. Normally, controversies involving a figure of his standing would generate immediate responses, defenses, or counter-statements. This time, there was none. By the third day, a senior figure within the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, speaking off the record, described the situation in a single sentence: "The Pope is not afraid." It was not an official statement, but it did not need to be. The message had already been understood. What made the situation more significant was not any single action taken against Müller, but what had not been done. He had not been stripped of his title. He had not been publicly condemned. There had been no formal disciplinary announcement. Instead, everything had been handled privately, with documents, records, and direct conversation. That approach created a different kind of pressure. A public punishment can be debated, criticized, or reframed as martyrdom. But a private confrontation supported by documentation leaves less room for narrative control. It forces individuals to respond internally rather than publicly. As the days continued, the broader atmosphere inside the Vatican began to shift subtly. Figures who had previously maintained independent platforms started postponing public statements. Some revised planned speeches. Others reduced public appearances entirely. It was not a coordinated reaction, but a gradual recalibration. The reason was not fear in the traditional sense, but recognition. The understanding that internal networks, financial connections, and informal influence channels were no longer invisible or untraceable. The awareness that they could be identified without being publicly exposed changed behavior more effectively than any announcement could. Müller's position remained formally unchanged, but his presence in public discourse had clearly diminished. Reports suggested he had returned to a private residence in Germany, away from media and institutional attention. No interviews followed. No statements were issued. His usual role in ongoing theological debates was absent. Within the Vatican, observers noted that the pattern surrounding him was no longer reactive but stabilizing. There was no escalation, no public conflict, no defensive campaign. Instead, there was stillness, and that stillness itself carried weight. Meanwhile, Pope Leo continued his duties as usual. In a public homily delivered shortly after the meeting, he spoke in general terms about the nature of the Church. His words were simple, delivered without reference to individuals or events. He stated that the Church was not a battleground for ambition, but a place of service and spiritual responsibility. Those who forgot that, regardless of rank, would need to remember it or step aside. For most listeners, it was a standard reflection. For those aware of recent events, it carried a different meaning. Inside Vatican analysis, what stood out was not confrontation, but method. Over the past decade, opposition within church structures had gradually developed into organized influence networks, involving media, funding, and coordinated messaging. What made this moment different was not that those networks were being attacked publicly, but that they were being addressed privately, one case at a time, with documentation rather than rhetoric. That shift created a new kind of uncertainty. It meant that exposure did not require public conflict. It could happen quietly, behind closed doors, with consequences unfolding afterward, rather than during confrontation. In the days following Müller's departure from Rome, several church officials reportedly requested clarification about future expectations. They were advised to communicate directly through formal written channels. Informal discussions, previously common, were now less frequent. The structure of influence had not been dismantled publicly, but its assumptions had been altered. Müller's personal future remained unclear. Some reports suggested withdrawal from public theological debate. Others indicated he was considering how to respond in writing. Nothing was confirmed. What was certain, however, was that the role he once held as a central voice in opposition discussions had changed. He was no longer at the center of conversation. He was now part of its history. And within the Vatican, that change was understood not as an ending of conflict, but as the beginning of a different kind of order, one defined less by confrontation and more by quiet boundaries that had already been drawn.